I'm going to show you how to run workflows through the Orchestrator REST API. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. In order to follow along with this video, make certain that you've gone to my GitLab repository and downloaded the Postman items and Orchestrator workflows. If you need to know how, read the instructions in the YouTube description below, or watch the previous videos. All right, as I said a few moments ago, we're going to learn how to run workflows through the Orchestrator REST API. Let's do that in the lab environment. As you can see, I'm logged into the Orchestrator client, and we're looking at 4 different workflows that we will be utilizing in this video and the next 2. We're going to start in this video with this workflow here called Hello World. Why don't we take a quick look at it? The first thing I'd like you to see about the Hello World workflow is its workflow ID. Notice, if you will, that its workflow ID ends in 22 Charlie 2. You don't have to memorize the whole ID, but I'd like you to memorize that much because we're going to see this workflow ID showing up again here shortly. Now, as you might imagine, the point of this workflow is to simply log a message that says Hello World. But let's see how it does that. This workflow has no variables. It has no inputs. It has no outputs. But it does, of course, have a schema. And as you can see in the schema, it has just a single scriptable task. And if we look at that scriptable task and look at its scripting code, it's pretty straightforward. It's just doing a system.log of the infamous message, Hello World. All right, so now that we've seen that particular workflow, let's go over to Postman. And what we're going to do momentarily here is to run the workflow. But one of the things that you'll notice about this particular REST request, if you look at it, it requires that we pass in the workflow ID of the workflow that we want to run. That's something that you need to know right from the beginning when you're working with the Orchestrator REST API. When you use the Orchestrator REST API to run a workflow, you do not say the name of the workflow that you want to run. Rather, you have to specify the ID of the workflow that you want to run. So how do we get this workflow ID? Well, you could go to the Orchestrator client and copy and paste it in here. However, that would hard code the value, and that wouldn't be very flexible. What you more likely want to do here in Postman anyways is to set the value of this workflow_ID variable. And you already know how to do that from the previous few videos. So why don't we do that again real quickly here? So we're going to go look up the workflow ID of the workflow called Hello World. So let's find this REST request. So get workflow ID by workflow name allows us to do that lookup. As a quick reminder, the way this REST request works is the test tab looks at the response body. The response body has all the workflows. It looks in the response body for the workflow that has the name of the workflow we're looking for. And the way that works is there's a Postman variable here called workflow_name. So we need to go set this variable's value before we can actually run this request. So let's go to Environments, VVork, and in here we're going to find right here our workflow_name variable. And this is its initial value, but we want that to actually be the current value. And once we've set that current value, we'll remember to click Save. And at this point, now we can go over to run the request to get the workflow ID based on the workflow name. Again, real quickly here, in case you didn't notice it, workflow_ID is blank right now, but when we go run this request, when we send it, check that we get back a 200, we did. Now if we go back to our VVork environment variables page, we can see that it has used the name Hello World to find that workflow, and it has set up the workflow ID in the variable called workflow_ID. So now we have what we need to run the workflow through the Orchestrator REST API. We're going to do that by using the run workflow request. Now, as you can see, the endpoint URL for this request starts off the usual way, but it ends with /workflows/ the workflow ID, which we're going to get from that Postman variable, /executions. The other thing to notice is that we're not doing a get. We don't want to find out about executions of that workflow that have already been kicked off. Rather, we're doing a post because we want to create a new running workflow. So post to that endpoint URL allows us to run the workflow. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just blindly run this here. So I'll click send. And when I do so, notice that we got a 400 bad request. The reason why we got that is whenever you run the request that we see here, you must set the body. The body that we're going to see in the next few videos is going to be more complex than this. But in the simplest case, your body needs to look like this. So it's a JSON object, but it's empty. That's all you have to do to pass in no inputs. So now that we've done that, why don't we go ahead and save this request? We'll send the request. Notice this time we got back a 202 to indicate that the request was accepted. And we've got some information about the request here in our response body. Up top, we have the workflow token ID. Now that's not the same thing as the workflow ID. The workflow ID identifies a workflow. A workflow token ID identifies an instance of that workflow running. Speaking of running, what used to be called a workflow token is now called a workflow run, but you'll actually see both terms used. I have been around Orchestrator for a while, so I still tend to say workflow token and workflow token ID because that's what you will see in the API documentation. In the Orchestrator client, they talk about workflow runs, but here behind the scenes, when you're working with the API, think workflow token. But they're the same thing. So why do we care about a workflow token ID? We know why we care about a workflow ID. A workflow ID allows us to identify which workflow we want to run. On the other hand, the workflow token ID allows us to talk about a specific instance of a workflow running. Again, why would we care? Well, because you can subsequently go do a query on that workflow token ID to find out what the current state is of that workflow run. That workflow run might still be running. It may have completed successfully. It may have failed, or perhaps the workflow token is in a waiting on a user interaction state. It's waiting for you to answer some question as the workflow runs. So we will see in upcoming videos how to make use of this workflow token ID. In this response body, when we kicked off the workflow run, it told us at the moment we did that the workflow was running. Now, obviously, by now, that workflow is done. The hello world workflow is pretty simple. It's done. But this says running because what we're looking at here is just a snapshot in time. The moment we started running the workflow, it was running. If you want to see the current state of the workflow, again, you would do a query on the workflow token ID. Next thing that we see is the date and time of when the workflow started. We can see who started the workflow. We can see which orchestrator server is running the workflow. We can see the name of the workflow. Additionally, we can see which item, if you go into a workflow and select a schema element, if you look over on the right side of the screen, you'll see that every schema element has an item number, like item number 0, item number 1, item number 2. Right now, this says item numbers undefined because this is the moment that the workflow just started running. But again, if we were to query the workflow token ID, this would indicate exactly which schema element the workflow is currently on. Then the last 3 sections here let us know what inputs you passed in, what outputs you should expect to receive, and what variables are in use in the workflow. Now let's talk about each of those individually. Input parameters is the old name for what we now call inputs. And similarly, output parameters are what we used to call outputs. So inputs and outputs are the new current name, Input parameters, output parameters are the old names, but they mean the same thing. An input and input parameter is the same thing. As you can see from the request body up above, I passed in no inputs. But if I had passed in one or more inputs, I could see here, starting on line 9, exactly what inputs and what values I sent into the workflow. Line 10 is blank right now because this workflow has no output parameters. But if this workflow was designed to return output parameters, we would see what they are here. We wouldn't see what their final value was because, again, this is just a snapshot of when the workflow first started running. But later on, when you use the workflow token ID to look at the current state of the workflow, not only will it say, here's the names of all the output parameters, it will tell you what their values are. And then the word attributes is, again, an old name for what we now call variables. So this last section, starting on line number 11, is informing you the names of all the variables in the workflow that you're running. Now, out of those three things, inputs, outputs, and variables, the only thing that you can affect when you kick off an Orchestrator workflow is the inputs. So inputs are what you're putting in the body. The inputs are up to you to set. Outputs and variables we'll talk about later. All right, so that's a lengthy discussion, but did it actually work? I don't know. Let's go take a look in the Orchestrator client. This here is the workflow, but that's not what we want to look at. We want to look at the workflow run. So let's close this workflow. We'll go to Activity Workflow Runs, and notice here it says that the Hello World workflow ran and completed successfully. Plus it also has information about the start date, the end date, who started it, and so forth, which is similar to the information that we just saw in the response body. Later on, when you learn how to do a query on a workflow token ID, you'll get back this same sort of information. Let's go take a quick look at the Logs tab for this workflow run. And as you can see in the logs, we see the Hello World message that's coming from our workflow. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.